Well, it's 4 o'clock, so you know what that means. Football at 4, as we do every Monday through Friday here on 97.3 ESPN. We bring in 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insider John McMullen to fill us in on everything Eagles related, from the injuries to the wins, coaching moves, and certainly a lot to talk about today with John as the Eagles win their 4th straight game. They clinch the NFC East Title. Like, when you say this, it's hard to even imagine all the adversity they went through, right? There's a 3rd straight trip to the playoffs. It's their 2nd NFC title in the last 3 years. All the accolades kind of sound like you're talking about the Saints or the Patriots. And here we were like 5 weeks ago, John, wondering, are coaches losing jobs? Is Carson Wentz really the franchise quarterback? Does anybody have a clue of what's going on? And now 4 weeks later, it's unbelievable, everything that the Eagles have had to endure to get to where they are.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, and I've said it for a couple of weeks now. I think this is Doug's best coaching job as a whole, no matter where it ends. If it ends this week or the divisional round, I can't imagine it going much further than that. But, I mean, the players that are out there, and acknowledging, I kind of said, in a lot of ways this might just be fool's gold because the NFC East is that poor as a whole, and this run has been directly inside the NFC East. I mean, there's not one win outside the division. So a lot of it is the opponents, but, you know, once Miles Sanders goes down in game, it's unbelievable. I mean, there's nothing. Zach's not out there. We've talked about the receivers. Boston Scott, Greg Ward, Deontay Burnett. And they're drawing up plays, and the Giants are terrible, but they're an NFL team. This isn't college where it's Alabama against Stetson or whatever. It's everybody has good players, and this coaching staff is dialing up plays for these players in winning professional football games. And you know, it's 17-7, Jeff, and I'm sure you're following along. And I'm getting criticism about the coaching staff. And I'm like, are you kidding me? The fact that they're in this and they have a good chance, even at that point, to win this division with what they've been given. I don't know how anybody criticizes this coaching staff. And that's not just Doug Peterson. That's Jim Schwartz. And, yes, Mike Groh. It's an amazing job, and I talked about it. John Harbaugh is going to be Coach of the Year. Some people will say Kyle Shanahan, which is legitimate, and I always say it's really Coach of the Year minus Bill Belichick because he's win it every year. But Doug should be in the conversation with any coach in this league for this performance.
We were talking about that and kind of where he stacks up, and I think you can put Sean Payton's name in there too for losing Breeze for 5 games and winning all of them. One of the things that, though, we kind of were tossing around, John, and I'm curious for your take on it, is because the last 4 weeks, in almost a snap of a finger, guys start catching the ball, Carson starts, playing more on target, the defense comes up big. All those things that we talked about that were not doing well during, October and November, whether it was a guy like Carson Walsh or, Mike Groh or Corey Unlin, are they all now like vindicated by this, or was it not coaching as much as maybe some of us thought? Because I think all of us in some form or capacity did isolate decision making and certain elements of coaching that were problematic when they were losing 5 of 7.
Well, I never thought it was coaching on the defensive side of the football. I think there were legitimate questions on the offensive side, particularly with certain position coaches, starting with Carson Walsh. And I would also say Press Taylor, as far as when you had that little hiccup mid-season with Carson, from a mechanical issue standpoint, I think it was fair to point out some of the footwork issues. So I think part of it was fair. I mean, Mike Groh, I think, is the highest profile name, and understandably so, because he's the offensive coordinator. But I've thrown this out to people, and they can't answer it. I mean, Jeff, These people are convinced he's a bad football coach. They don't know what he does.
Right.
And the reason I know that is because I don't know what he does. And I'm there every day. So
this is like Office Space. Can you tell us what you actually do here?
I'm
a people person.
That's just the nature of having an offensive head coach and the coordinator. It would be the same if they had a defensive head coach.
Sure.
Doug calls the plays. It's Doug's offense. And the same would have been held true for Frank Reich. I mean, they all think Frank's a great coach, and I think Frank's a very good coach as well. But they didn't know what he did, and they don't know what Mike does. And I think it was interesting, to say the least, that Doug brought up Mike's and the assistants, because he's very in tune to what's written and what's said. Doug Peterson, I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And he went out of his way to bring up, and the first two names he mentioned are the first two guys who received the most criticism, Mike Rowe and Carson Walsh, for getting players ready off the practice squad, ready to play, ready to contribute. And I think it said a lot that he went out of his way to laud those guys.
John, we talked a lot earlier about why does it always feel like, and we've talked about this a lot before, but especially now, why it always feels like Doug has to be completely both hands tied with absolutely nothing at his disposal for the offense to look the way it has, and the constant success you look over the past 3 years now, and it's always some major adversity or glaring holes as far as injuries that this team has to overcome for them to really be clicking and getting in a rhythm offensively.
Well, a couple things to that. I don't know if they are in a rhythm offensively or it is just bad opponents. I mean, they weren't great offensively against Dallas. And the Giants and the Redskins are what they are defensively. I mean, the Giants are awful defensively. That back seven is just an abject mess. So you put that part into the equation. So you're going to have to see as they get into the playoffs. And I think they have a good opportunity to beat Seattle, who's banged up. And obviously it's very difficult to play here at Lincoln Financial Field. But we'll see how they're able to perform now that they're going to be playing good teams. No matter who they face the rest of the way, it's not going to be an opponent from the NFC East. It's going to be a good football team. So I think you'll start to see what's real and what isn't, to be honest. So that's part of it. Now, and I think each year is different, but this team, and Doug considers himself an underdog, and you go all the way back to the Super Bowl year. And I've said it a lot. That whole narrative was nonsense, to be honest. And the Eagles were the best team in football for most of that year, certainly the best team in the NFC. And everybody thought that late in the season. Now, granted, when Carson goes down, everybody thought they're done because that's what you think. When you lose your starting quarterback in the NFL, it tends to be over for you. So the Eagles embraced that underdog narrative. They even have it on their Super Bowl rings, but it wasn't true. Everybody knew the rest of that team was really, really good. And if Carson was healthy, well, the Eagles are significant favorites over Atlanta, significant favorites in the NFC Championship game. And then when he gets to the Super Bowl, they're probably underdogs against the Patriots because it's the Patriots. But so part of that is nonsense. Last year, it was still a good football team, and they embraced it again when all the adversity. This year, it's totally different because this year, you're talking about Boston Scott, and you're talking about Greg Ward, and you're talking about Deontay Burnett. And these are literally guys the fan base never heard of. I would guarantee most Eagles fans didn't know who the heck Deontay Burnett was. Didn't know they signed him, didn't know they brought him up, didn't know he was going to play. So this year it's very, very legitimate as far as the underdog role. And I think Doug is a longtime backup quarterback. He considers himself an underdog. And then you go back to when he was hired, and everybody thought it was a terrible hire. and Mike Lombardi said what Mike Lombardi said. So Doug has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder and thinks people don't believe in him, thinks people don't believe in his team, and he uses that, and it's worked to this point.
Talk about the play on the offensive line, because another topic that we touched on earlier, they've played absolutely fantastic, and I know the opponents have something to do with it, but you lose Brooks, Lane Johnson's not there, and there was only, I think, one sack that Carson Wentz took. I know he's getting the ball out a little bit quicker, but how important has this offensive line been in their recent success?
Well, very important. It's the strength of the team and significant. I would argue when they're healthy, it's the best offensive line in the NFL. And that's the one thing they've been able to lean on. Now, you lose Lane Johnson. He's been out for 3 weeks, and then Brandon Brooks on top of it. That's going to be an issue if Lane can't get back on the field. I mean, at some point, the attrition takes over. And I think you're at that point on the offensive line. If they have to go into the playoffs with Vitae at right tackle and Matt Pryor at right guard, that's going to be an issue. I think they can make do with Vitae, and they have in the past, and they continue to do so. I think he's underrated. I think he's a starting level offensive lineman in this league. But there's a lot of bad offensive lines. That doesn't mean he's a high-level player, just that you can make do. But when they're healthy, I mean, that's the thing they lean on, and they should, because you're talking Kelsey is an all-pro, Brooks is an all-pro, Johnson's an all-pro, Peters is going to the Hall of Fame, and Isaac Seumalo is the runt of the litter, so to speak, but he's a competent starter. It's just really good. And when you look at the context of the rest of this league, and you'll see one this week, Seattle's offensive line is a disaster. And it's even worse now that Dwayne Brown is out and they've had to go back to George Fant at left tackle. And it's been a disaster for years. Talk about Minnesota all the time. Their offensive line has been a disaster for years. People don't realize how good the Eagles' offensive line is.
Carson Wentz was criticized for not elevating the wide receivers earlier this season, and we were discussing how some of the players from the practice squad might actually be a little bit better than normal practice squad players like Boston Scott. But when you see 5 or 6 practice squad guys doing this, would you say that this is Carson Wentz elevating his wide receivers?
Well, I there's a couple different levels to that. I think, and I always point to Aaron Rodgers in his prime. There was a guy who elevated, like everybody who played receiver on the Packers was just looked like a superstar. He's not at that level, but few are, and few ever have been in the history of the game. I think most of it, to be honest, and by the way, I'm a guy who has said Carson has played well for the vast majority of the year. So I'll start with that. B, I think more of it has to do with the scheme and the coaching and scheming these guys and what they do well. There were passes down the field that Carson missed pretty badly yesterday, and there were opportunities for bigger plays. I think, this spike has been, and I joke, screen, and then run and screen some more. So it's been a lot of easy throws, for lack of a better term. And some of the downfield stuff still isn't there when the opportunities are there, like Boston Scott, but I don't know what that was. I mean, Boston was open down the field. He might have ran a bad route. Because he's a young running back who is not used to being in that situation, or Carson could have just missed him badly. It's kind of difficult to tell. But those downfield throws are still not there. They're still not consistent. So I look at yes and no, but I think more of it has been the scheme than Carson elevating these guys.
Well, we were talking about that a little bit earlier, John, about how much we can realistically expect next year, what we've seen over the last 4 weeks carrying over, because this is clearly an offense that Doug is being forced to run. And while it seems to have helped Carson spread the ball, take the checkdowns because it's a checkdown-based offense now, do both Doug and Carson, do you think that they take something from this into next year when the weapons look a lot different? Or do you kind of get concerned that once next year starts and the real Doug Peterson offense comes back, then you might see some of the same habits that were hurting them earlier in the year?
Well, I think you can't run this offense and be successful consistently against good teams. And I think you'll see that at some point in the playoffs. So, I mean, you have to get better. You have to have better skill position people. And once you have better skill position people, you got to do different things. You got to put stress on the defense, put more stress on the defense. So they have to start going downfield when they get players who can do that. And I think you go all the way back to week one and Deshaun Jackson, and they're certainly capable of doing it. One, you have players on the other end who are playing at a high level and capable of doing it. I think a lot of it has to do with the disappointment. Alshon Jeffrey had a bad year. Nelson has been terrible when he was out there for the most part, and we've talked about the drops, and even the Dallas Goedert game. It seems like everybody, even Zach Ertz, had a bad game in Miami. You don't expect that, but when those guys are out there playing at a high level, you should be playing differently, and people should expect them to play differently. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think that's just a part of it, but guys have to execute, and they weren't executing earlier this season.
Yeah, I think the Seattle game threatens to really challenge our viewpoint as to what's real and what's not real. If they beat Seattle, and I know Seattle's got its own issues too, so the playing field might be a little bit more level, but if they beat Seattle with this screen and crossing route, nickel and dime type offense and are able to score, 24, 30 points in that, then it's going to be, whoa, you just finally actually did this against a playoff caliber team that's pretty good, that's hard to beat. And I don't know, it might be saying something about maybe the construct of the offense and what's the best way to get Carson Wentz in his best rhythm. Because you're right that some of these games, even though they've won 4 in a row, it's not been smooth sailing on offense. And even against Dallas, which is probably the most impressive win from a team standpoint, opponent standpoint, they didn't score a lot of points in that game. That's why this Seattle game kind of will really test our theories on whether this is kind of fool's gold against really bad teams or if they've got something figured out with Carson and the construct of the offense.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's, kind of what I said. How much is real and how much isn't? How much is fool's gold? How much is it NFC East opponents? How much isn't? I do think you have to look at Boston Scott specifically and say, that guy has performed at a level where he should be in the mix to be in the offense, and whether you want to call it the Darren Sproles role, whatever, when they get guys back and when everybody's healthy. Obviously a change up, not saying he should be getting significant touches if Miles Sanders is out there or even Jordan Howard, but he's proven something. And then Greg Ward as a slot receiver, I think has proven something to at least be in the conversation to carve out a role for himself. And then the tight ends are just flat out good when they're healthy. I can't imagine Zach's going to be out there with a lacerated kidney, but we'll see. Doug refused to confirm that today. And, the whole key is the outside receivers. And Deshaun would open that up, but you can't trust a 33-year-old speed guy. Alshon Jeffrey is what he is at this point. They've got to get better outside, and that will open up the offense. So I think you integrated some of the stuff they're doing now, and if you have a chain mover inside at the slot, well, that's going to help you. That's going to help your offense because you're not only going to extend drives, you're not only going to have that security blanket, But that's the most important. If you stay on the field, it gives you more opportunities to hit the real playmakers. I think it's important to have role players.
Who of the walking wounded do you think is most likely to suit up against Seattle? That includes Lane. It includes Jalen Mills, Jordan Howard, who was active but didn't, I think, play more than a few snaps, if any. Who do you think is most likely to play that right now seems uncertain?
Well, I think they're all going to play, but Jalen flat out said he's going to play yesterday
good.
After the game, and he's going to be he said he'll be out there. So I would imagine that's the one guy who I'd say there's no question. I think they've tried to cobble through. You know, the fact that Jordan Howard was dressed, Doug kind of gave it away during the week that they were game planning with Miles in Boston. So he was only going to be there in case of emergency. They've done that pretty consistently this year. Guys who've been out for significant periods, they dress them and they ramp them up. So I think he'll be more involved, but certainly the fact that he was dressed, that's clear he'll be dressed again. So he'll be available. And then Lane, I think they kind of, were betting that they could get through these games against inferior opponents without Lane Johnson with the eye on the playoffs. So to be honest, I expect to see them all out there.
Even Ertz and Miles, you think we'll give it a go?
Well, not Ertz.
No, I didn't. Yeah, that's what I was wondering on Ertz. Okay, because Doug said he was going to try to incorporate him into a little bit of practice or something.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, I mean, lacerated kidney.
Yeah, and we all know, Jeff. You know where that's coming from. So it's Ian Rappaport.
Right.
So I'm going to give the initials. That's coming from HR. I don't know. It's not human resources, so people can figure that out. But so, I mean, he's got a lacerated kidney. He's not playing.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. I don't know why the Eagles are playing those games, but the Eagles are the Eagles when it comes to injuries and messaging.
I don't know. Can he play in 2 or 3? I mean, if this thing goes on.
He's done for the year.
That's what I would think.
Lacerated.
I think Miles Austin did that when he was with the Browns the year before he came to the Eagles and was out for the whole year. So, yeah, it doesn't seem.
Yeah, Andrew Luck did it. He's probably the most famous of the recent. But that's a month-long injury minimum. And if things go perfect, maybe you can get back after a month. So, yeah, I would not count on Zach Ertz. That's the one guy I would not count on.
Well, the early line, within 10 minutes of last night, it had the Seahawks. The Eagles favored by 3, and then within 10 minutes, I guess everybody was putting money on Seattle, and now it's Seattle by 1. So it'll be very interesting. Both of these teams are very beat up, John. I mean, I do think the playing field is a little bit level, but man, the Eagles. They just can't win for losing. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's every game somebody of some significant value goes down.
Yeah, I mean, Brandon Brooks, that injury is massive in so many ways. I mean, if you go back to the divisional round, I mean, Jason Kelsey and a bunch of players, and Jason was the one who verbalized it and said we were a right guard away from going back to the NFC Championship game. I mean, that's how the Eagles felt, and they lost him early in that game. So that is a huge loss. And he has arguably been not only the best guard in the NFL, but the best offensive lineman in the NFL, regardless of position. So that's not your run-of-the-mill loss. And then you just add Zach Ertz. We don't even talk about Alshon anymore. And
Nelson. And
even somebody like Nelson, who hasn't performed, but is somebody because of his athleticism, because of his ability. It's not like you can leave him alone. You have to acknowledge him as a defense. There's just so many losses. The fact that they're even in this position. That's why I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is Doug Peterson's best coaching job, and it's not close. It really isn't.
Right. That's our John McMullen, Eagles insider for 97.3 ESPN.com. You can check out his story right now on the website. Intangibly Great, explaining Doug Peterson's success. You can catch John on Twitter at JF McMullen. And as we do, we'll talk to him again tomorrow, 4 o'clock. Football, not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow, because tomorrow's Thursday. Yeah, we'll catch you again Thursday, John. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you work on a holiday there. My bad.
All right, thanks, guys.
We'll catch
Appreciate
up
it.
with you on Thursday.